Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 11 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. This time around, only 5 new cards, and nothing too exciting, no new legendaries or anything like that. A little bit of a lull in the reveals today, it seemed like. But anyway, still 5 cool cards, some neat new effects, and some things certainly worth discussing. So as always, here's how this is going to work. If you're only here to see the card reveals and you don't have a ton of time, you can click a link in the description below. It'll take you to the end of the video where I do my really quick 5-star reviews and just run through each card rapid fire style. If you've got some time and you want to hear me ramble about these cards, well, now we're going to go ahead and jump into the detailed portion of these reviews. Up first is a new Priest card called the Shadow Ascendant. This is a new 2-mana minion for Priest, and it's a 2/2 with a very strong effect. At the end of your turn, give another random friendly minion +1/+1. So the first thing of note here, I think, is that this is another 2-drop for Priest, which for a really long time hadn't got any good 2-drops, and now suddenly it seems like they're getting a new one every expansion, Radiant Elemental, of course, being the most recent one. And I actually think Shadow Ascendant has the potential to be another strong 2-drop. Now this, at first glance, might look a bit like an aggro card or, maybe a Zoo Priest style card that's all about building up a board and being really aggressive. But do remember, because this happens at the end of the turn, if you play a minion on turn 1 and then you play Shadow Ascendant, you're not going to get an instant buff on that minion. So this effect essentially is never going to get charge, right? It's going to take a turn for these stats to actually start to pile up. It's not an instant buff by any means. So I don't think this is necessarily as, aggro designed as it might be just a kind of a snowball style card where a Priest can play some pretty strong stuff on turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, and curve out really nicely so that this Shadow Ascendant kind of just lingers around and tends to pass off, +1/+1 here, +1/+1 there, before the opponent can really start to deal with this minion. So, the perfect example is Northshire Cleric on turn 1, Shadow Ascendant on 2, Cabal Talon Priest on 3, and then just moving on down the line, maybe just a Priest of the Feast on 4, or whatever it could be. But, with all of those sort of high-value targets on board, right? So if you get that Northshire Cleric, your opponent's going to want to use removal on that Northshire Cleric, and then you follow up with a Shadow Ascendant. Now they have 2 prime targets. The Northshire Cleric becomes a 2/4 minion when you move into turn 3, which is even harder for them to deal with. The Cabal Talon Priest then hits the Shadow Ascendant, so on and so forth. Now that's clearly like the dream curve scenario, right? The problem for Shadow Ascendant, and the only real downside for this card, is when you don't have minions on board, and that can often be the case, then this just becomes a really flat 2-mana 2/2, which is hard to utilize. So I think for this to work successfully, you'd have to build a Priest deck that does have a very consistent early game curve option. Otherwise, this is going to be the kind of thing you just tend to throw down next to a Priest of the Feast on turn 6, just sort of a random pile of cards, and the Priest of the Feast becomes a 4/7 instead of a 3/6. It's fine, it's not bad, but it's not that game-winning, defining kind of play like this could be if you get it out early enough. But Priest does have early game options now. I could even see this working in a Death Rattle style deck, where with Death Rattle minions you tend to have more things lingering on the board, just because if they summon cards off the Death Rattle, then you have more stuff laying around. You have a more resilient board. This is more likely to hit buffs. But all of that said, I think the real challenge for this card is what kind of deck do you run it in? Do you have to build a Zoo Priest or a more early game Priest? And if you do that, would you just be better off running a Control Priest that doesn't need a board-based card like Shadow Ascendant because it has so many other kinds of tools? So would a Death Rattle Priest really, at the end of the day, need this, or they just want more Death Rattles? There's a lot of questions to answer there. So this card looks good, right? It looks like the effect is strong. It's got a decent body tied to that effect for its cost. So all of that looks solid. It's one of those things where I don't know if Priest needs this exact minion. Maybe it's good enough to define a deck or at least carve out a new sort of way to play Priest, but I don't really think that's the case. So I think this one will end up falling through the gaps a little bit. A lot of other classes, like Shaman for instance, would love to run Shadow Ascendant. I'm not sure Priest wants to run it quite so much. So despite the fact that it looks like a good card, I'm still not sure it's going to see a ton of play. It has the potential to. Solid arena card. All of that fits. I just don't think that most Priest decks are going to make a spot for Shadow Ascendant. So now let's move on to a card that everyone's freaking out about and everyone is talking about. This is the Skulking Geist, a new neutral epic minion. It's a 6-mana card. It has 4 attack and 6 health, and a very divisive battle cry that lets you destroy all 1-cost spells in both players' hands and in both players' decks. So as soon as you play the Skulking Geist, nobody gets 1-mana spells anymore. So the first and most powerful, obvious utilization for this card is to counter Jade Druids with Jade Idol, because this kills all the Jade Idols in their deck. Even if they've cycled 25 Jade Idols into their deck and they have an infinite resource of Jade Idols, as soon as you play Skulking Geist, poof, they're all gone. Every Jade Idol is dead. So that is the most obvious utilization for Skulking Geist. It's a pretty direct counter to Jade Druid's fatigue win condition. But you'll note that Jade Idol's not actually the only 1-mana spell typically used by Jade Druids. They also use Earthen Scales for that big armor up potential. So this really goes at Jade Druids. It actually hurts Token Druids a little bit too with Mark of the Lotus. Other notable examples of 1-mana spells used by classes in the meta right now are certainly Evolve for Shaman. Token Evolve Shaman decks need that Evolve. And Priests run Inner Fire sometimes too, so this could kill those Inner Fire combo potentials available to, like Silence Priests, for instance. But all of that said, clearly this has targets. This is meant as a tech card for certain kinds of decks, typically more combo-oriented decks, because, damage spells like Sinister Strike and Cold Blood, also 1-mana spells. So you can go through the list and look at all the 1-mana spells that are available in any given format. Clearly, in Wild format, for instance, Mysterious Challenger gets a lot worse against Skulking Geist because you kill all of the Paladin secrets. There's 1,000 examples, right? You can go through and look at everything and see how this can be a good tech card, but ultimately it's just a tech card against a specific kind of thing that happens to work across a few different decks. So it has a place, right? This card makes sense, and frankly, for 6 mana, as a tech card, these stats are pretty good. When you compare this to like Big Game Hunter, for 5 mana now, those stats look pretty bad compared to Skulking Geist for 6. Although, of course, Big Game Hunter does have more applications typically, and it's not even a tech card we see anymore these days because most classes have enough options for hard removal. But the problem with Skulking Geist, I think, is that if you take those examples we looked at, for instance, Jade Druid, right? Even if you kill all of the Jade Druid's Jade Idols, they can still win the game. They can still create really big Jades with all the other Jade tools they have available. The only real value you're removing from that matchup is the fatigue value. When they go really, really deep into the game and they just keep cycling Jade Idols forever, that's the only thing you're taking a big chunk out of, right? Yeah, of course, you remove a couple Jade Idol summons from the pool and the Jade Idols are a little smaller or whatever, but really, at the end of the day, you're just removing those fatigue Jade Idol cards that get cycled forever, right? And, of course, the Earthen Scales. And Jade Druid doesn't need those to win. They can still just get a ton of used Jades. We've all seen Jade Shamans beat us with Jades without Jade Idol, right? So you're only sort of hurting that in a very specific matchup, which is if you're a really late game control deck, specifically trying to beat really late game Jade Druids, Skulking Geist fits. Otherwise, it's probably not worth compromising your deck too much, just because you need to focus on your gameplay and less about countering your opponents. But that said, Skulking Geist is still the kind of card in a control meta that can keep Jade Druid in check, because if Jade Druid ever swings too high and too strong, pull out the Skulking Geist, shut it down for a while, and the meta will shift. So it's a really important tech card in that it exists, because it does provide those answers. Against Evolved Shaman, though, I actually don't think Skulking Geist makes the cut. If it becomes a popular tech card, you could just cast your Evolves before turn 6. It doesn't always have to be Doppelgangster Evolve, not to mention the fact that Evolved Token Shaman can win without Evolves. Sometimes just swarming the board and Bloodlusting is more than enough, and Skulking Geist, again, makes for a dead draw a lot of the time, so it's going to be hard to run this all the time. It's not like every deck is going to put in a Skulking Geist. Just very, very occasionally there might be one here and there if Jade Druids, take over, if some other 1-mana spell becomes a really powerful part of the meta. It's important that Skulking Geist is there. It's sort of a gatekeeper. It's a check on the meta, but I don't think this is going to be a meta-defining card itself, or you know, something we see all the time. It's just going to be a tech card like all the other tech cards. And frankly, this one I think has a much more specific use than do many of the other tech cards like weapon removal. Even Eater of Secrets, you know, secrets are so much more common than really, really meta-defining one-cost spells. So I think even Eater of Secrets is going to be seen more often than Skulking Geist, at least in this current meta. So, fine card at the end of the day. Cool that it exists. I'm glad it's there. I'm glad Blizzard recognizes the Jade idol problem and gave people a tool to handle it. But still not a card that's going to be everywhere. That's for sure. So now let's move on to a new Shaman card called Ice Fishing. Once again, we've got some frozen Murloc stuff here. Of course, this doesn't really have anything to do with freeze synergy. This is just a 2-mana cycle spell that allows you to draw 2 Murlocs from your deck. And that's actually really good. Getting 2 cards for 2 mana is a very efficient play when you think about other kinds of card draw like Arcane Intellect, for instance. And frankly, the fact that you get to control what kind of cards you draw is also, I think, an advantage, because if you're looking specifically for Murlocs and you build a deck in a way that drawing Murlocs is really advantageous for you, then including in Ice Fishing gives you a really efficient way to get exactly the kinds of cards you need. So that feels like a very strong design. Now, the ultimate question there is there going to be a Murloc Shaman deck that makes sense? Quest Murloc Shaman has been kind of lingering around the lower tiers in the meta. It's probably a playable deck, but was never that great. I don't know that Ice Fishing even fits Quest Shaman all that well. It could if you shape the deck in the right way. Maybe there are other ways to play Murloc Shaman and this card enables them. I think there's actually even a little bit of utility for this card outside of a Murloc deck just because of cards like Corrupted Seer, for instance. You could use Ice Fishing to pull out your Corrupted Seers, almost like the Curator today is used to pull Primordial Drakes specifically. Ice Fishing could be a really cheap way to make sure that you get some sort of consistent AoE with Corrupted Seers. And maybe there's another Murloc, for instance, like Burlock. So maybe you just tech in a Burlock and a Corrupted Seer, and that way you know you can always draw a card with freeze if you need a freeze, and a card with AoE if you need AoE. And if you know you've already drawn them at some point, then this gets a little bit worse. But this could be that kind of card where just a handful of Murlocs in your deck makes this one worth it, even if you're not a Murloc deck. And then, of course, if you are a Murloc deck, really good value here just to give you more bodies. Pretty consistently, pretty cheaply, too, at 2 mana. So you still have mana remaining to load up the board with Murlocs and accomplish whatever your goal might be. So really, I think this is a great card. It's a neat design. I'm not sure it's going to be played just because it has to fit into that world of Murlocs. But, you know, outside of that context of the actual meta and actual decks, everything about this card is solid, so I like the design a lot. It just needs to find an environment in which to live. And then up next we have a new Paladin spell at 2 mana. This time it's Desperate Stand, and this is basically Redemption, but in a targeted spell instead of a secret, because it has the exact same text. Give a minion Death Rattle, return to life with 1 health. So yep, anytime that minion dies, it's coming back, it's being redeemed essentially, just like the secret. But obviously, being able to target a specific minion with a Death Rattle that brings it back to life is much more valuable than giving your opponent the control as you do with Redemption and the Secret, because a lot of times that can backfire. It doesn't always hit your Tyrion, for instance, but with Desperate Stand, you can always make sure that it hits your Tyrion. And of course, when you do resummon something with 1 health, obviously it works best on Death Rattle minions or Divine Shield minions, some kind of minions that can take advantage of the fact that they're probably going to die again very quickly or be a little bit more difficult to kill thanks to that Divine Shield. So Paladin has an assortment, a wide array of minions that do fit that need. So this is not a problem. The 1 health aspect, it's fine for Paladin. There will still be ways to use this. The bigger question is whether or not Desperate Stand is actually any good. Clearly we've seen this in Shaman already with Ancestral Spirit. It's basically the exact same card, but Desperate Stand is a little worse because it only gives them 1 health. So Ancestral Spirit is a strictly better version of Desperate Stand, which is okay because it's available to different classes, and Paladin, as I mentioned, has more tools to probably make a card like Ancestral Spirit even better. So it's okay that they're unique. It doesn't necessarily make Desperate Stand strictly worse, but in this case, it still is obviously a little worse. And Ancestral Spirit, although a card that has been played a little bit here and there in Control Shamans with the right kind of synergies to support it, has never been a meta-defining card. It's never been a nightmare to play against. And for those same reasons, I really don't think that just because it's in Paladin that Desperate Stand will be either. I still think this is going to be a pretty hard card to use. It's going to require you to build your deck too specifically. Maybe a Control Paladin here and there just pops this in for the Tyrion value or whatever other kind of crazy big minion value they're trying to pull off. Very susceptible to silence, unfortunately, which is one big problem. So if any card like this ever got too good, silence comes in. This does have some potential applications in a buff style deck, like maybe a Last Kaleidosaur deck. This is just another targeted buff kind of spell, so keep an eye out for it there too. Nothing fundamentally wrong with this card, but as is the story with a lot of the cards in all of my reviews so far, it still has to have somewhere to be played. So it's an okay card, but again, it needs a deck to support it, and I'm not sure there's going to be one because it might just require too much fine-tuning and too much fiddling to build a deck to really make this card good. And then finally, one last card here. We have a new rogue spell at 2 mana. This is like the 2 mana spell review. This time it's called Roll the Bones, which is a euphemism for throwing the dice. Essentially, dice used to be called bones, I guess, back in the olden days because they're like made of ivory. So roll the bones, roll the dice, and that's essentially exactly what this card does, because you draw a card, and then if you got lucky, if RNG is on your side, if the dice roll the right way, and that card has a death rattle, then you get to cast Roll the Bones again. This is another one of those conditional spells that we've seen in Knights of the Frozen Throne so far, like with Defile, for instance. If you get 2 cards out of this, again, much like we saw with the Murloc draw, pretty good card. 2 for 2 mana is fantastic. That's great. If you get 3 or more, it's just absurd, right? So if you really high roll with Roll the Bones and get 2 or 3 death rattles, you're going to feel really, really good because that's an efficient play. And thankfully, I don't have to do the math on this because I actually already saw some math on Reddit. Somebody posted essentially some simulations to see about how many death rattle cards you'd need to really make this card worth it. And their assessment, and I haven't checked the math on this, but it sounded pretty reasonable and sounded right to me, was that essentially your deck would need about 15 death rattles to average 2 cards drawn with Roll the Bones. So it actually requires you to have quite a few death rattles to get 2 cards out of this, which is where the efficiency really starts to turn over in your favor, right? If you just get 1 card, it's not the worst thing ever to pay 2 mana to cycle a card, right? That's a playable kind of thing. Flare has done that for Hunter in the past. If you didn't unveil Stealth or pop a secret, you still played Flare. Same thing with Warrior, has done that in the past with like Battle Rage. It's okay if you just get 1. It's an alright outcome. Clearly not what the card is ever designed for, but it's not the end of the world. So Roll the Bones, worst case scenario is okay, I think. And best case scenario can really help you refill your hand. The downside, you have to run this specifically in a Death Rattle deck. So this has no application whatsoever outside of Death Rattle decks, because otherwise it's just a 2 for 1. You spend 2 mana for 1, I should specify. You spend 1 card for 1 card. It's just a cantrip. It's just a 2 mana, fairly inefficient card draw. So I don't think you ever see this necessarily outside of a Death Rattle deck. But in a Death Rattle deck, I think it's very, very good. Every deck needs card draw. This is an efficient one that can occasionally probably win you games in a value matchup or late game matchup just because it refills your resources so quickly. And Death Rattle Rogue is one of those decks that seems like it's very close to being good. So if it becomes good, Roll the Bones will be an important card and will be good. If Death Rattle Rogue does not become a thing, we won't see this card. That doesn't make it bad in and of itself. It just won't be played very often. Okay, so that was it for my detailed reviews of these 5 cards. So now what I'd like to do, as promised, is run through my quick reviews where I rate each of these cards from 1 to 5 stars. So let's go ahead and jump into that process. I think Shadow Ascendant is a 3-star card. I think Skulking Geist is a 2-star card. I think Ice Fishing is a 4-star card. I think Desperate Stand is a 2-star card. And I think Roll the Bones is a 3-star card. And there you go, guys. That's it for part 11 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. Of course, as always, I want to hear your take on these cards. What's good? What's bad? What did I get wrong? How crazy or stupid am I? Save those screenshots so you can tell me 2 months down the line when all these cards surprise me. I'd love to see that stuff. But until then, guys, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.